Thank you to Beatrice, who has dropped the link to the slide deck in the chat. And we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks to everyone for being here today. We appreciate it. My name is Alyssa Meltzer, and I'm the Director of the Continuous Improvement and Accountability Department at the Santa Clara County Office of Education. We're going to be using this time today to discuss the changes to independent study legislation for the 22-23 school year. And I hope that we will be able to answer your questions as we go. If I cannot answer them today, I will definitely do some research and get back to you as soon as possible. Next slide, please. We are recording this meeting today, so we will share it out via our website and via email to our district independent study liaisons after the session today. Next slide, please. Today, during this meeting, we are going to review the resources that I'm providing. We're going to review the updates to independent study per AB 181, the new education trailer bill. We will have some time for questions and answers, and then I'd love for our district independent study liaisons to be able to chat amongst themselves if they'd like to. Next slide, please. So this is the resources slide, and Beatrice has put a link to the slide deck into the chat, so you should be able to utilize these resources later after our meeting today. The first one is just a Google Doc that I've created with the up-to-date language from AB 181 as it relates to independent study. I just sort of copied and pasted it into a Google Doc so you didn't have to deal with the whole entire large bill to find the different sections that you may be interested in. So this is one small part of AB 181. The second link there is a summary, is the summary of changes document that I sent to our AB 130 district liaisons, independent study liaisons back on July 7th. So you can take a look at that if you want to refer back to that. The third document is a copy of the home hospital instruction ed code, which we'll talk about a little bit later when we get to slide 11. And then the last link is just the link to our Santa Clara County Office of Ed website. We will be adding this webinar and resources there as we did last year. And when we add new resources, we will definitely let our independent study district liaisons know that we've added them to the website. Excuse me. Next slide, please. Thank you. Legislative intent. The overarching intent of the legislature is to encourage LEAs to consider offering more than one model of independent study, so a short-term option and a long-term option. And the legislature definitely believes that by providing students with a range of quality educational options, such as classroom-based, hybrid, and non-classroom-based programs, LEAs can better tailor instruction to our students, thereby improving academic outcomes while maximizing enrollment. So that is the intent of the legislature. All of that being said, and I think what most of you are most interested in is that for the 22-23 school year, independent study is encouraged but not required as it was last year during the 21-22 school year. So please also note that at the bottom of each slide, I have linked the applicable ed code so that you can easily find the corresponding part of the ed code and the legislation as you dig deeper into this. Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide just reminds LEAs of the different reasons why an LEA may choose to offer independent study. That being said, it is not limited to those examples listed here in ed code. The third bullet on this list, which has been crossed out, has been removed from the language this year. This may be important to know if it's listed in your board policy or administrative regulations. You may want to update that. But all of the other ones are still in play. As we've discussed, providing independent study for students who would be at risk by being in person at a school or need to quarantine due to COVID is still part of the language this year. That's one of those questions that's come up in our independent study liaison conversations. And I just wanted to sort of loop back to that and let everyone know that the COVID clause is still part of the legislation. And as you can see in the slide, when you read more carefully, the COVID clause is still determined by the parent or the guardian of the pupil, or the need for that is still up to the parent or guardian. Next slide, please. All right, so I think we're all used to the fact that there is a 10% apportionment cap in terms of those being served through independent study. But this year they did add a clause that allows an LEA to provide independent study to a larger percentage of students if there is a declared emergency. The bulleted lists are examples mentioned in Ed Code, but I don't think that we are limited to those emergencies if there are other declared emergencies that may come about. Amir, I see that you have your hand up. Do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, yes, please. Thank you so much. I know that it says here that independent study is encouraged but not required. But let's say, for example, I'm a parent and I have concerns about my child's safety with COVID. Then the parent's sort of in the driver's seat in terms of whether they get independent study or not. Like, is it at their discretion? I think when you were just explaining this, I just want to so if I'm a parent, can I demand to have independent study?
Can we go back one slide, Shara? Thanks. The way that I'm interpreting this, and I know that there are some people on this call that are really big experts who I'm not going to call out right this second, but if you want to chime in, please feel free. The way I interpret this, Amir, is that it is up to the LEA this year whether or not you want to provide independent study. And so when I look at that list and I sort of think about independent study in prior years, prior to last year when it was required, these are some of the reasons why you might do it. Some districts chose to provide independent study if a student was traveling. Other districts before 21-22 decided that they weren't going to provide independent study when a child was traveling. So I do think that because it's encouraged this year, the LEA has the choice has the ability to make that choice as to whether or not they're providing it. Elvia, I was hoping you would chime in.
Well, I was thinking that I was probably the one that you were calling out, but so the answer, really the short answer is no, that the parents can't demand this. The LEA has the option to either offer it or not. And if they don't, because we've gotten this question already from parents, and we're asking them to look outside of their LEA or the district if they want to explore an adjacent district, a charter school, but they can't demand that the LEA provide it.
Thanks, Elvia.
Mm-hmm.
Elvia is from the CDE, so that's why I consider her a much larger expert than me just here at the county office. All right, let's move forward to the next slide, Shara. Thank you. All right, so students with disabilities. I believe last year, as partway through the year, we learned that we actually needed to allow students with disabilities to participate in independent study if their IEP team made the decision that it was an appropriate setting for them. And this year in AB 181, that is true, and it is written into the legislation. So if you have students with disabilities whose parents request for them to be utilizing independent study, then the IEP team will have to make that decision. And this is applicable to both traditional and course-based independent study. Elvia, do you have another question? I see your hand up. I don't want to ignore you, but it might just still be up from before. All right, let's move on to the next slide. All right, tiered re-engagement procedures have been updated again. Triggers for implementing tiered re-engagement changed a little bit after AB 167, and then they have changed yet again through AB 181. And this is the most up-to-date language. The two parts that are new per AB 181 are highlighted in yellow here. Please pay close attention to chronic absenteeism and utilize local programs to address it for your students in independent study, just as you would for students in the classroom. During many of the revisions since February, when we started to see this language, at one point there was conversation, or there was an inclusion about something about requiring LEAs to use their SARB process for students in independent study as well, but that never made it to the final legislation. But it does just tell me that it's important for everyone to be paying attention to chronic absenteeism and to make sure you have procedures in place to deal with that for your independent study students. Also, the participation in synchronous instruction expectation is now that you utilize tiered re-engagement procedures when a student is missing 50% of the scheduled times within a school month. The re-engagement strategies used to be triggered if a student was not participatory for the greater of 3 school days, or 60% of the synchronous instruction in a school month, school month. And now it has been reduced to 50% of the scheduled times within a school month. So hopefully this will be a benefit for some students who were struggling to make it to all of their synchronous instruction periods. And perhaps it will be a benefit for districts as well, giving you a little bit more flexibility in regards to student participation in synchronous instruction. The other 2 bullet points on the slide should not be new to you, as they were in place last year. All right, next slide, please. Written agreements. Okay, our written agreement timelines have changed this year. I believe last year you had up until 30 days after a student started participating in independent study, but that definitely has changed this year. If a student is entering into long-term independent study, which is more than 14 cumulative days over the course of the entire school year, the written agreement must be signed before participation begins. So if I'm not mistaken, I think that's how it was prior to 21-22. And so for those going into long-term independent study, we're back to that expectation that you sign the written agreement prior to participation. If a student is entering into short-term independent study, which is 14 days or less, the written agreement must be signed within 10 days of beginning independent study. Also, please note that the same people need to sign the written agreement, but this year, as is highlighted in yellow here, if the student receives special education services, that certificated employee designated to provide those special education programming services must also sign the written agreement as well. Amir?
So sorry to ask another question. It relates to the previous slide. So what, and this is about independent study and SARB. I heard it mentioned earlier today by someone that SARB is not available as a remedy for somebody who's not completing their assignments or not attending in independent study. Do you agree with that? Or it seems to me from what you said, I'm not sure I see that.
I think that that's a local decision, Amir. I'm gonna let your LEA make that decision.
Prohibition though, right? It doesn't say you can't use SARB.
Correct, that is true, yes. And I
Okay.
will, I think that part of this goes to, well, let me let Elvia chime in here.
Okay.
And then I'll add on.
So I'll just say that it shouldn't be SARB because we don't, attendance is not, it's, for example, is based on the students completing the work. And for example, if a student shows up to a classroom, in-person instruction, but did not do the work that was required, did not turn in their homework, they're not marked absent, they're sitting in the seat. So every LEA has an attendance contract that is approved by the CDE. So you may want to take a look at that because independent study is included in that, and independent study students should not be SARBed. That should never be an option. And in fact, if David Cupperud were here, he would tell you that. So yeah, no, you have to go through, because there are already, I think, 3 full stops in place for accountability. The tiered re-engagement strategies is one of them. If the student is not turning in assignments for X number of days, which is in the written agreement and the board policy, we need to reevaluate with whether this is the right option. So there are already things in place in order to support the student, or find out, is there a reason that that student is not submitting their work, for example. So for independent study, SARB should never be an option.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, this is just a reminder that for your students who are in independent study for short-term independent study, so less than 15 days, we know, and this was the case last year, we know that you do not have to engage your tiered re-engagement strategies. You do not have to provide live interaction or synchronous instruction or a plan to transition kids back within 5 school days. However, for students in long-term independent study, that still obviously is a requirement for independent study moving forward. The legislature added this section to the item in the yellow box to the language this year, which explains that students receiving necessary medical treatments or inpatient treatment for mental health care or substance abuse are exempt from these expectations, as well. So when we talked about this with our independent study liaisons at a previous meeting back in June, one of the questions that came up was, how does this clause differ from home hospital instruction? And so, Elvia, I can let you answer that if you want to, or I can sort of share some of the answers that we received from the CDE, School Fiscal Services Division, which talked a lot about the differences in terms of driving apportionment between home hospital instruction and independent study, which
I actually was going to say, because it's a condition of apportionment and there's fiscal implications, that would be a School Fiscal Services question. So if you've got an answer from them, that would be best.
Okay, great. So what the Fiscal Services Division has said is that ultimately what it comes down to is that the attendance, accounting, and instructional time requirements for both home hospital and independent study are very different, right? So our home hospital students receive instruction and generate attendance for apportionment under the immediate physical supervision and control of a certificated employee of the school district. And I believe that if you read the ed code, which is linked up on slide 2 or 3 earlier in this presentation, with home hospital, you provide 1 hour of instruction a day, and that is equivalent to a day of attendance, correct? Obviously, the amount of time a student engages with independent study is far greater than that. And independent study students receive instruction under the general supervision of a certificated employee, and they generate their attendance from either the time value, as we know, of the student work products, or as is new this year, which we'll talk about in the next slide, through the combined time value of student work product and student participation in synchronous instruction. So a home hospital student cannot receive individual instruction through independent study. That being said, if a student meets the requirements for home hospital, they also may be able to participate in independent study as well, depending on what their medical issue is. So if that's the case, they could either utilize home hospital or independent study. The student and their guardians would need to decide which they would like to enroll in. And then the LEA would need to ensure that the applicable attendance accounting was in place. So that is the very long answer from School Fiscal Services Division. And I think what it comes down to is it's going to depend on what the students' needs are and whether they are able to tap into home hospital, if they can tap into independent study, and picking the one that is most appropriate for that student. That being said, if your students are taking advantage of independent study while receiving medical treatments, the LEA should obtain evidence from the appropriately licensed professionals for the need for the student to participate in the independent study. So make sure you are documenting that and getting a note from the doctor to ensure that you have all the documentation in place. All right, next slide, please. All right, so this sort of goes back to something I talked to in the last slide. There has been an update to apportionment credit. And this year you may claim apportionment for the time value of the pupil work products, which has always been part of independent study, or a combined value of pupil work product and pupil participation in synchronous instruction. I think it's going to be very beneficial to LEAs and will help to alleviate the burden of requiring a teacher to have students produce a work product during synchronous instruction like they had to do last year. But please remember to document participation and in synchronous instruction carefully so that you can claim apportionment as appropriate. Next slide, please. Next steps for you. I would say that it's important to think about writing or I would say probably at this point, amending your independent study policies to make sure they take into account the new requirements in AB 181. And then the same with your written agreement, make sure that you're amending that to ensure that you've incorporated all of the most up-to-date information. And those independent study policies must be adopted at a board meeting, and they need to be adopted at a board meeting prior to students participating in independent study so that you can claim apportionment.
ADRs I wrote for all those kids on
Information regarding course-based independent study begins with Ed Code 51749.5, which you can read in the independent study doc that's linked here. And just a reminder for our course-based independent study LEAs, of which there are very few in Santa Clara County, your courses need to be certified by the board on an annual basis. So if you are utilizing course-based independent study, make sure that happens, please. And teachers being a certificated employee of the LEA is still part of the expectation this year. I know it was a big question last year. So I just wanted to remind everybody that that is still an expectation for this year. Next slide, please. Those are the main updates that I wanted to share with you all. And so I wanted to open it up for questions and discussion. Are there any questions that have not yet been asked that people want to ask? Feel free to come off mute.
Alyssa, there was one question in the chat regarding the slide about students with special needs and if they needed to have an amendment that allows for them to have an independent study in their IEP or not. So I don't know if you, is it Stefania? I don't want to mispronounce her name. Did she answer that for you, or do you still have that question? There's only one question in the chat.
Yeah, so I'm wondering in regards to students with IEPs that maybe want to go into IS because of COVID related reasons, maybe like exposure or, you know, they have it. Do they still need to go through an amendment meeting, or is that not, does that not apply to them because of COVID? That's my only differentiation I want to make. If that makes sense.
Can you repeat that again so I can make sure I understand the question? If yeah, repeat it again so that I can make sure I understand. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I know that if students with IEPs need to or want to go into independent study, they need their like ISD specialist to make that decision for them. But is this also true if they need to go into IS because of COVID related reasons? Or is it the same process regardless of the reason, is what I'm asking.
I think it's the same process. If they want to use independent study, they need to, your IEP team needs to make the decision that it is an appropriate placement and program for your student.
Anytime there's a change in a direct service that's going to be different than what's in the IEP, you need to have an amendment that documents the rationale why for that change and how that student's needs will be met. So if they're going to independent study, you have to document how the student will receive those services that the IEP team dictated in the IEP. And if they can't be met, that needs to be noted in your notes. But anytime there's a change in service, there needs to be an IEP to amend that, because whatever is in that IEP, if you're not providing that service, then you're in violation for due process. And so if you don't provide what's in the IEP that the IEP team agreed upon, then you're out of compliance. So if you're going to place that kid on independent study, it needs to be an IEP team consensus, and any services that students receives, or if they change, you need to note that in the amendment.
Okay, that's clear. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Shara. Allison, I see your question as well. So yes, because LEAs have the option to provide independent study this year, you can cap enrollment due to program space, and you can have a wait list this year based on space. Any other questions that we can answer for you? All right, so districts, Santa Clara County districts, are there any questions that you may have for your colleagues in other parts of our county that you may want to ask? All right, we're a quiet group today. I wonder if we could find a way to connect teachers who are overseeing independent study. That's a good idea. We will write that down. Allison, I think that probably is from you as well. And we will think about trying to figure out how to do that. Perhaps we can utilize our independent study liaison group to try to figure out how to create a network like that. So we will think about that from our perspective and sort of see if we can figure out how to address that. And then there's another question in there. If a student was in independent study and had the IEP agreement last year, do they need a new one for this school year? That's a great question, Tatiana. Shara, I'll let you answer that as well. If they were in this program last year, do they need an update this year?
They must always have a current IEP with current services. So if they were in the program last year, they need a current one for this school year as well.
Thank you. All right, Sheetal, we are continuing with Calvert and courseware. I just wanted to know what other districts are using. Great question, thank you. Anybody else willing to share what programs? Thank you. While people are answering that, Deb, can I answer a question for you? I see your hand is raised. Deb Padilla, do you have a question?
I did. Can you hear me?
Now we can, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, my chat's not working. I'm wondering if other districts are allowing for inter-districts into their independent study.
I know that Sheetal from Oak Grove had said before that they were willing to engage in that conversation because they were moving forward with their independent study program this year. I see her shaking her head, so I believe she is open to that.
Hi, Deborah from Oak Grove here in San Jose. We are accepting students. Right now, we are close to being full in our K-5 elementary class, but we have at least good 10 spots in our 6 through 8 middle school class. So if you have any family, or if anyone has families that are looking for that option, we are taking interdistricts in Oak Grove.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we're just looking at it because we're almost at our capacity. And, obviously we're taking district students first. So just wondering how other districts are dealing with that.
Yeah, and if anyone has any students that are looking for a placement, they can contact me because I'm the administrator for our virtual learning program here in Oak Grove.
Sheetal, do you want to put your email address in the chat? Thank you. When I probably back in June, I think I sent an email out to our AB 130 Independent Study District liaisons asking if any other districts were accepting students, and Sheetal from Oak Grove is the only one who responded. So if anybody else is interested in doing that, please feel free to let us know in the chat today or reach out to me and I can connect you with other districts if I hear of districts who are in need. I know that some of our smaller districts within the county are interested in tapping into some of the bigger programs at some of the bigger districts because it's more challenging for them to staff independent study. So if people want to reach out to me, either with a need or with openings, I'm happy to try to be that conduit to connect people to the best of my ability. All right, any other questions that we can answer for you? All right, everybody. Well, we will let you go.
Sorry, I have one more question. I'm also overseeing the short-term independent study, and I was just wondering if other districts had samples of their short-term master agreement because I'm looking to revise ours for this year. So if anyone has one, I would love to see it.
Thanks, Annie. Annie will email you one of theirs. And thanks, Dane, for letting us know that you are still accepting, that we, Santa Clara County Office of Ed, is still accepting students in 6th through 12th grade who are comfortable using Edgenuity. All right, everybody, those are the big changes. I don't think that they're huge, and based on the heavy lift that all of you had to do and did so eloquently last year, I'm hoping that these changes are not as overwhelming and scary and as last year's were. So I think knowing what great programs you all have in place, I'm confident that you'll be able to move forward with greater ease this year than we were able to do last year, given all that we had to put in place in such a short amount of time. As always, please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. And while I have dug deep into independent study over the last year with you guys, I definitely do not know everything about independent study, but am always willing to do the research for you to answer any questions that you may have. And our team in the continuous improvement and accountability department is always here to do that work for you. So Tatiana, yes, I'm sorry. I don't think we ever got to, I never asked Shar to send us to the last slide in the slide deck, which says, thank you for being here. Shar, don't worry, we don't need to bring it back up, but my name and email address, there we go. My name and email address is on there. And Beatrice just dropped the link to the slide deck in the chat again. So you guys should all have my name and email, and feel free to reach out with any questions that you may have. I know I'm sorry, one last thing. I know people are interested in perhaps getting samples of updated board policies. We were doing a little bit of work here at the County Office of Ed in the last day or so, looking at our board policy, and I was reading through it, and there were sort of minimal changes that we needed to make to it based on these updates. CSBA says that they are going to share some sample board policies in September, which I assume will come out in September, but I think most of you probably have to get your board policies approved prior to September because school starts in August. So if I see any examples, we will add them to our website. But it seems as though, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the board policies that you put in place last year should be relatively valid with slight updates based on the new information from this year. All right, I think that's everything that we have. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. Please feel free to reach out with any questions, and we will see you soon. Enjoy the last weeks of summer, and we wish you all a very great start to the new school year. Thank you.